Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar. I'm delighted to be presenting as our sponsor for today, Syncada from VISO, and our two presenters are going to be looking in particular at 2012 is a year of change in electronic invoice adoption. How, in particular, will your own organization adapt? So I extend to you a very warm welcome indeed. My name is Susie West, and I'm the founder and CEO at sharedserviceslink.com. Sharedserviceslink.com is the leading business community for shared services professionals, and we have about 7,000 members, and it's our central aim to help our members improve their business performance by extending best practice information through conferences, through webinars such as this one that we have today, and through information that we make available to all members on our website. So after this very insightful session, I urge you to go on to sharedserviceslink.com and download as much as pertinent information as possible that will help you running your operation. I'm very pleased to be having on the speaker panel today Kurt Dahl, who's the Business Director of General Payables at Syncada from VISO, and Henry Ijams, Managing Director at PayStream Advisors. So let's have a look at the agenda for the next 60 minutes. I'm going to be touching on how the questions work and looking a little bit at the context before I hand over to our two presenters. We'll then be closing 4 questions in the last 10 minutes of this webinar. In terms of questions, you've all come here today for a reason, and only you really know what that reason is. And I ask you just to make a note right now, if you will, of what it is that compelled you to register for this webinar today. And please, if you feel that you're not getting the actual kind of answers that you're looking for, the Q&A session in the last 10 minutes is the ideal time to get those questions answered, and our speakers are very readily available to answer them in a very kind of pinpointed, specific way. So how does that work? You need to send me your question nice and early, please. You need to just key that into the box that I've marked in red, and I will then put that question to the speaker in the last 10 minutes. Please do make a note, the sooner that you ask me or send me that question, the more likely it is to be asked. And do remember to stay on for the Q&A. It is a very valuable part of this webinar. In terms of context, let's have a look at why we're having this discussion today. When I interview a lot of shared services leaders in Europe and also in the US, e-invoicing is certainly in their top 3 priorities. It's very much front of mind for high volume multinational organizations today. And the reason for that is because the business case for e-invoicing is huge, as far as accommodating figures that are factored in regarding headcount savings, but also savings that come from dynamic discounting opportunities. And that really is always a second-tier component that always needs to be factored into an e-invoicing business case. The only thing is that I've found over the last few years is that organizations drag their feet a little bit as far as the implementation is concerned, because they think about things like supplier onboarding, and they think about supplier onboarding being a big deal for them. And I know that Henry's going to come on to that later. But e-invoicing implementations, although they need to be considered in a very, very serious way, and there needs to be serious commitment, they're a lot less scary than a lot of organizations think they are. So with all that in mind, I'd now like to introduce our first presenter for today, Kurt Dahl, Business Director, General Payables of Syncada. Over to you, please, Kurt.
Thank you, Susie, and welcome, everyone. Syncada is pleased to be sponsoring this overview of electronic invoicing adoption in 2012. And now, without further delay, I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker, Henry Ijams, Managing Director of PayStream Advisors. Henry, it's been great working with you these past weeks, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Kurt, and delighted to share with you some insights that we're seeing from both our clients and from the recent research that we've done at PayStream Advisors. PayStream Advisors is a research and consulting firm focused on finance and procurement automation. And over the past 12 years, we've been studying this marketplace to understand how it's impacting the overall transformation that we're seeing in procurement and payment. Specifically today, of course, we're going to talk about shared services, those organizations that have made the leap, and PayStream's analysts study the technology. As consultants, we put it into action. So you're going to see a little bit of commentary that I'm going to give today, taken from both the research components that we do and the elements that think about the implementation. So I'm going to give some case studies, some real live examples to answer the core question, how will your organization adapt? And to answer that question, I want to give you some look at some of the innovators, what others are doing, to give you some ideas about how you may take advantage of that inside of your business. So let's go on and think about our agenda. When we think about the challenges associated with manual paper-based processing in AP, we're going to talk about how that drives change and how you can use that as a stimulation for change in the organization. For the past 12 years, when we think about this, we know that most of you are still reliant in one form or another on paper, whether it's 20% or, well, 90%. Most of us are still recognizing that invoices are coming to us electronically, or coming into us in paper. Even if they're coming electronically, say via email, many of us are still printing them out. So we know getting over the paper is a big issue. The next big theme we're going to talk about is barriers and overcoming those barriers, including the adoption of our suppliers. So, but to get started here, we're going to ask a poll of what you are working on in your organization. What technologies are you implementing to help automate your finance shared services operation? And we're going to give you a list here, and you can select more than one. Go ahead, Susie.
Thank you very much indeed. Henry, so coming up on your screen now, what technologies are you implementing to help you automate your finance shared services operation today? This is a multiple choice, please, so please do tick all that apply. ERP implementation or upgrade, for example, maybe Oracle or SAP implementation or upgrade. Workflow implementation, E-Invoicing, perhaps you're shopping for e-payables, automation solution, or other. If you can tick all that apply, please. We normally look for about a 70% response rate here. We're currently at about 36%. And just to highlight to you, the more people that respond to these benchmarking questions, the more meaningful the data. So just one more time, please, if you haven't already responded, what technologies are you implementing to help automate your finance shared services operation today? ERP implementation or upgrade, workflow, e-invoicing, shopping for an e-payables, automation solution, or other. We have 66% of you voting, closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at the results coming up on your screen now, ladies and gentlemen. You can see very clear winner there, with 60% of you mentioning that you are implementing electronic invoicing. So interesting results. Back to you, please, Henry.
Wonderful. All righty. Well, as we dig in more into our content, we want to think about where we have been in accounts payable specifically, and then, well, what does it look like tomorrow? The current process of AP today is kind of like a Rubik's Cube. It's all scrambled up. When it's on paper, it means that we really can't access the information that's on those documents in a way that's meaningful and powerful to our overall finance operation. The questions that we answer generally are more related to reconciliation, accounting, data entry, managing some risk, certainly, making sure we get the right accounting data. And so we can answer some key questions. Did we account for this properly, and what did we buy? When we think about the future and tomorrow is here for many of us, the companies that are innovating here are figuring out how to align this data and take these Rubik's Cube and turn it into one that's perfectly set up so that we can allocate our costs properly, our time properly, and the third dimension being the working capital. So we can answer new questions such as, when is the invoice due? When should we pay? Instead of hurry up and pay, which is what many of us do. And why did we buy that? In other words, we can move the working capital needle and have new opportunities to innovate in our finance operations. When we think more generally about purchase to pay and more broadly outside of accounts payable, we're thinking, of course, as many of you are, as around purchase to pay. What does our purchase to pay solution map look like? Well, many of you have started on one component of this or another. Some of you may have started with working capital components on the right, or on the left side, e-procurement and supplier collaboration. So when we think about procurement, we're thinking about what can we do around cataloging or setting up online tools for us to allow for electronic requisitions. What we know is that the best practice here is that organizations that do this up front can much more easily, of course, do the electronic invoice component. In other words, what we like especially is organizations that can manage some of the purchase order delivery process and in the invoice receipt in the same system. We call that part of the purchase-to-pay continuum e-procurement and supplier collaboration. So it's a component, it's a building block, if you will, of what we think is the core essence of electronic invoicing. The next piece is looking at the electronic invoicing and marrying that with the electronic matching and workflow. So many of you already have some kind of a workflow component to ingest these invoices. If you don't, you absolutely need it because, well, for many of us are just getting our electronic invoices today via email and coming in via PDF. We don't have a system to extract those invoices and do what we need to do with them without, say, just emailing them around. The matching and the workflow, depending if you're using purchase orders or other matching of contracts, is a core component of where the value proposition comes in. Certainly we want the electronic data, but if we remember back to where EDI took us, well, having it electronic may not be all that it's cracked up to be. Why? Because, well, it's pretty hard to find an electronic transaction that's fallen on the floor. Early adopters of EDI learned this when the groups that were managing the EDI were in the IT department. Well, what do we do with those invoices that don't match? Well, somebody in IT had to work with the IT group on the other side. Today's electronic invoicing world is one where it's truly collaborative, where I can connect with my suppliers and connect with my internal users in an interconnected network. And so, core theme that we want you to think about is how will you make change in your organization? Well, there's some building blocks that you need to do to have that. The neatest part is that when we add these two together, we can add up to payments and working capital. And what we're seeing today is that a third of the business case for electronic invoicing is typically coming from the payments and working capital elements. In other words, it's not just about the transaction, but it's about that transaction and what it means for our organization. In other words, the data is powerful for us. Now, PayStream has created an innovation lifecycle to track where these different types of technologies fit. I started talking about front-end imaging and workflow applications. That's right in the middle, in the mature and high-growth phase. About 46% of Fortune 1000 companies already have the imaging and workflow components to take advantage of electronic invoicing. The neat part about this is that now those tools, the imaging and workflow, are now being bundled with the electronic invoicing. So on the right side of our chart, we talk about the different types of technologies that are impacting shared service operations. Paper check in the States is going down at about a 3 to 4% annual rate for business-to-business transactions. EDI, as I was talking about, electronic data interchange, is a relatively mature component of how we communicate with our suppliers. Still growing for the invoicing side because many organizations that are just using it for transmitting orders and ship notices are now really starting to use it for more and more for invoicing. So we're still seeing about a 6 to 7% growth in financial EDI, the components related to invoicing. And many of you are using P-cards, so we're not going to talk about that today, but if we have a faster approval cycle, it means we can use more of our purchasing cards for buyer-initiated push or integrate with single-use accounts or single-use payments, a very powerful element of the overall financial supply chain. Now, electronic invoicing here, as you're going to see in a few moments, is rapidly moving up the curve. It's still in its early adoption phase for most businesses, although for Fortune 500s, as you're going to learn a little bit later, the adoption is really, well, way into the mature phase. What's not mature is that we may not have reached 100% adoption. Now, related to electronic invoicing and the innovation save and introduction is tools like supply chain finance and dynamic payables discounting. And those are where the working capital elements bring these two together. let's move on and get into our next poll question. What's the most important shared services piece? Let's go on. Is it a poll, or are we going to move on to our, yeah, there we go. That's it.
Poll coming up now. Yeah, what is your most important shared services objective this year? Just one choice only, please. Is it to automate more financial processes, improve service delivery, improve the customer journey, reduce your costs, or improve controls and visibility? So just one choice only, please. 24% of you voted. So if you can make sure that you do participate in this, we were 66% for the first poll. If we can try and beat that number, please. So just to repeat the question, what is your most important shared services objective for this year, 2012? To automate more financial processes, improve the service delivery, improve the customer journey, reduce costs, and improve costs, controls rather, and visibility. Improve controls and visibility. So just choose one. It's generally assumed that all of them will count, but which is the main one driving the others? We're at 66% again, closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. We're closing that poll on 68%. Let's have a look at the results coming on your screen now. We have 35% reducing costs, just ever so slightly followed by, in second place, 33% coming in at automating more financial processes. So very interesting results there. Back to you, Henry.
Wonderful. Well, it's glad to see that in this environment, many of us are trying to figure out how we can reduce our costs. So let's figure out how we can answer that for you. When we think about your strategy to move to electronic invoicing, I can for sure tell you that there's a very strong business case. The typical environment that we're seeing is costs being reduced about 50%, but that's just the beginning. So if we have an opportunity for reducing our transaction costs, as we drive our paper down, we're increasing our ability to pay suppliers early and do different things with our working capital. Very core component of the overall electronic invoice adoption. Notice in our chart here, we create a plan, and this is what you need to do. If we're going to go forth with a plan to move to electronic invoicing, what we want you to do is say, okay, how fast are we going to drive down from where we are in paper today to electronic? Notice that this client example, done in mid-2009, the client wanted to reach an overall goal by 2013 of almost 50% of the transactions to be electronic. That's the great news. And many organizations have already done that, as we're going to share in just a few moments. So the core piece of your plan is drive down the paper-based invoices. Of course, use purchasing cards if you can, but use electronic invoicing through networks to drive overall adoption. So when I think about this, the next piece is saying, well, how do I set my benchmarks? How do I build this plan? What are the payables that make us a green accounts payable department? Well, we've got some good news for you because it doesn't take that much. If we've got really 4 metrics that we want you to think about as you move towards this electronic universe. The first one is, what percentage or how many vendors are we going to enroll in our electronic invoice system? For many of us who have 5, 10, 15, 20, or even 50,000 suppliers on our network, do we need to get all of them to come in? Well, what we're seeing today is that the best-in-class organizations can achieve 60 or 70% electronic invoice transaction penetration with just 400 or 500 suppliers. This means that, well, of course, we don't need to boil the entire ocean of our 10,000 suppliers in order to make this work. We need to work on the biggest, the ones that are developing this most volume. For some of us, the segmentation may be related to which of these invoice types are creating the most pain for us. Is it coming from a certain supplier community? Perhaps it's your direct materials. Or for many of our clients, it's not. It's not the direct because those are already moving on another kind of electronic platform. But it's our indirect. It's our services spend. So we're very excited. This is to try and make you realize that the benchmark is not that high for you to jump up and grab the brass ring of electronic invoicing. The next component we want you to think about here is what's your exception rate. exception rate is where you have to touch an invoice more than once to have it post into your system. If you touch it, if invoice comes in and it posts on the first pass against, perhaps it's a PO-based invoice, you can match our PO, the counting strings are correct, and the receiving data is correct, our price, quantity, and unit of measure is correct. Well, exception rates for most of our clients, unfortunately, are typically between 8 and 12%. That means that, well, that cost of an invoice could be 4 or 5 times for those invoices. Why? Because once we can't process that invoice, it means we have to reach out to others in the organization, recognizing that there's something wrong. It's either the purchase order is wrong, the price is wrong because the supplier priced it wrong. Most of us find that internally we're making most of the errors, that our suppliers' billing systems are generally quite accurate and correct. So how do we drive down that exception rate? The good news is electronic invoicing gives us an incredible amount of visibility to where the data is wrong so that we can start doing an analysis on how to eliminate it. Many organizations are moving forward with lean manufacturing or lean finance techniques or Six Sigma. You've heard those terms. A lot of them are based on these core principles around exceptions. Where's the exception coming from and how can we eliminate it? The easy ones for you to answer really relate more to where is my invoice processing volume per staff. What we know is that a paper-based process typically tops out at around 15,000 invoices per year. The clients that move forward with electronic invoicing typically can drive that ratio to at least 30,000 invoices per year per AP staff, and many moving up to 60,000 a year over several years of implementation. How? Because they're essentially driving up the adoption and driving down the exception rate by improving the overall process. The last one here, which is a green payable benchmark that we want you to think about, is getting to 50%. What percentage of your invoices are at 50%? Here's the good news. It's very common that most customers and clients who implement these kinds of solutions within 24 or 36 months can easily get to the 50% barrier. So that for those of you who are on the path, perhaps you're already getting some electronically. But in your plan in the model that I was showing in the previous slide, you can easily achieve 50%. Many of our clients are over 70, 80, 90%. We have a great example of a client that's at 96% electronic. And yeah, they're doing it. It can be done, and you can do it in your organization. I think it's time for our next poll question.
Thank you very much indeed, Henry. So poll number 3 coming up on your screens right now. What are the barriers to implementing electronic invoicing within your organization today? So is it lack of IT support, loss of check flow, supplier adoption, lack of integration with ERP or accounting systems, or lack of remittance information? So these, please do tick all the boxes available to you and all the boxes that are relevant to you. Again, we're at about 32% of you have voted. This might not necessarily apply to all organizations, especially those that are now live with e-invoicing, but if you're looking at e-invoicing right now and you're looking to go live with it, what are the barriers to implementing e-invoicing at your own organization? Lack of IT support, loss of check flow, supplier adoption and the size of it, lack of integration with ERP or accounting system, lack of remittance information. Closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, coming up on your screen now, you can see there's a very clear winner with 82% of votes saying that one key barrier to entry or barrier to implementation for you in your organization is around supplier adoption. So interesting results there, and back to you please, Henry.
Wonderful. Okay, well that is a universal, and that's wonderful that everyone recognizes that, because the sooner we recognize it, the sooner we can realize the answer. The answer here is that we think about the building blocks of a paper-free and an electronic process is really related to adoption. But it's not just supplier adoption. It means changing our business process. The core 3 here that we use are centralizing invoice management into a common system that we're giving overall control and visibility. Then this piece that we're talking about today, automating the receipt invoice process, the matching and approval, and promote the use of electronic invoicing. How do we get our suppliers to adopt? Well, what we know here is the best practice is to do this through a network. Unlike a movie such as Field of Dreams, which the tagline was, "Build it and they will come," it doesn't quite work like that. And while it may work well for Walmart and the federal government, what we have learned over the past 11 years of doing this, that clients that move to a network solution, such as Syncada by VISO, have the ability for that organization to go in and enroll their suppliers and bring them in. In other words, it's not really up to you, but it's up to your partners. We're going to talk more about that in a couple of moments. I want to take you into some of the results around our invoice management adoption survey. So PayStream has included close to 300 CFOs, VPs, and AP professionals in our survey. People like you, in fact. We've covered lots of different industries, such as retail, healthcare, and insurance. And based on the number of respondents, we believe this survey is pretty accurate for the North American market. Overall, when we think about adoption of electronic invoicing solutions, amongst the biggest companies here, and our survey is both big and small companies, we're going to see that overall adoption is around 20%. So only 20% of companies say that they're using an electronic invoice adoption survey. What we know is that, well, that's good, but here's where it really gets fun. For those of you who are larger organizations, we're seeing the adoptions pick up close to 30% for Fortune 1000, and by the time you get to Fortune 100, nearly 90%. In other words, the largest industrial companies have already done this and already figured it out, as we show in our invoice adoption survey solutions. Now, the cool thing is that many organizations are also moving in this realm. So each year, in the last column here, we say we do not use an e-invoicing solution and have no plans to implement one. That keeps going down. More and more people are taking their head out of the sand and saying, yes, this is becoming a best practice. We realize it. We realize it's no longer speculative, no longer an early stage technology, but one that we can take advantage of. Now, as I said, the largest organizations are really nearly 90% of adoption. Depends on where you are and the size of your organization. The big guys have already got a lot of the smaller and medium-sized suppliers hooked up. That's the benefit of being part of a network. So let's move on and think about the benefits of electronic invoicing from this survey that we did. What we can see here is that the top benefits are related to what just everybody wanted, reduction in cost. This is taken from the survey that tells us the people who answered the question we've already adopted. The people that have already adopted are seeing a reduction in their staff, 50% saying reduction in staff. And notice here, reduction in the exceptions and discrepancies and the increased on-time payments. And this is where our working capital componentry comes in, as you're going to see in just a few moments. When we think about the methods used to trade business-to-business invoices, still today, the adoption challenges, well, it's real, because 64% of the B2B invoices are still being sent on paper. Well, unfortunately. For many of us, though, we're still getting invoices, but a lot of them are coming in via email on PDF files. I was at a client last week when they said, well, what percentage of your invoices are coming in electronically? And they said, well, we have about 10% on EDI, but we're getting about 40% emailed to us in a PDF file. What do you do with those? Oh, well, we print them out. Now, when we're sort of looking through those invoices, this is something that we want you to think about. When you look at those invoices that you get via PDF, are they coming right from the accounting system of the business that you're dealing with? In many cases, they are. They're coming right out of the billing system. In other words, that supplier has the capability to create an electronic invoice. If he were only asked, he could probably give you the electronic file for a machine-to-machine transmission. And the networks that run these systems are very capable at taking in a variety of different file formats So the adoption really is not a challenge of getting our suppliers to adopt. It's more about how we can engage with them and bring in the different types of file formats that they can provide. Here's how we're going to see that. When we think about the percentage of suppliers converting to an electronic invoice, we can see that, well, it's getting better. And from this broad survey of businesses of all sizes, including businesses as low as $100 million, we can see that many organizations are saying, unfortunately, the majority, that we're only getting 10% of our suppliers. But remember, that's not the core piece. 10% of our suppliers may yield close to 60 or 70% adoption. So there's a pretty interesting metric that helps us think about this in another way. Overall, as I summarize here, I want you to think about the best practices in and around electronic invoice. And I'm going to start with the core piece. The core piece that many of you are saying is a challenge for you, getting suppliers to adopt. The first thing is I want you to think about we don't need all of our suppliers to adopt. It's not the 10,000, but it's the 10%. You see, some of us don't want to get started because it seems that the journey is a little too complicated for us. It's not. And the organizations, the most classic that we see is that the client of ours run an RFP, select a vendor like Syncada, move forward, and within 3 years, 50% or more of their invoices are magically moving electronically. In that time, there's been a tremendous transformation of the data and the access and what we do with that data. In other words, we now have information that helps us make better improved and faster decisions about what's happening inside of our organization and answering new questions. When should we pay this supplier and how? Not hurry up and pay, which is unfortunately the practice at most of our organizations. If you have a paper-based AP process today, we know that the general approval time between when the invoice was created and it gets approved in your accounting system is between 21 and 23 days. Adopters of electronic invoicing are achieving that cycle time in more like 7 to 10 days. For them, they have new ways to overall control their working capital. The next core piece in our best practice trio here is providing multiple options for electronic invoicing. That means if you're using EDI, electronic data interchange, wonderful. Some of your suppliers already take EDI or already provide EDI. Well, that's wonderful, but that's just the beginning of the story. Most of your suppliers don't. And of the top 400 or 500 that you have, you're going to find that, well, maybe only 100 or so are going to be EDI capable. And that's why it's wonderful and it's best practice to have a multiple option input. So imagine a funnel, and at the top of the funnel, we're going to sprinkle in the magic dust that makes e-invoicing work. The first piece is that we have to be able to handle any kind of input, and that there's no filter on the top that says, nope, sorry, can't handle that. First one being PDF files coming in via an electronic email. EDI interchange for electronic data interchange. Purchase order flip. That means if I transmit a supplier to them through a network solution, that the supplier flips that order into an invoice and sends it back to me. In other words, it's my data being turned around into an invoice with the quantity and the shipping date. That's essentially what an ASN is, Advanced Ship Notice, inside of an EDI network. Purchase order flip, very powerful. The next piece is web templates. In other words, templates that allow small suppliers, medium-sized suppliers, to upload even Excel files, PDF files, their actual bills directly out of their accounting system. Maybe it's even the image. The last piece here is a direct file upload or direct integration that's custom made for us, for our supplier. And the good networks have gotten very sophisticated and have developed those inputs at the top of the filter. So it's pretty much anybody can throw anything in there, and it's going to work. The last piece here is that we see that the innovators are using and figuring out how to make the working capital components come alive by the electronic invoice adoption. Because we're so interested in this, because a third of the business case, a lot of the money can flow from changing our working capital dynamics, including things like supply chain finance, dynamic discounting, as Kurt's going to talk about in a few moments. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Kurt.
Thank you, Henry, for being with us again today. Syncada is a global financial supply chain network providing, among other services, payables automation through a web-based software-as-a-service platform. I like to describe our capabilities in terms of the life cycle of an invoice: receive, audit, code, route and approve, pay, and post. And we'll get to that in a moment. But first, some general information. Syncada is a joint venture between VISO and our participating sponsor banks through which we market our services. Currently, our sponsor banks are U.S. Bank, Citibank, Commerce Bank, and in the European Union, Elimination. Syncada's mission is simple: to build an open, global payment network that banks can offer to their corporate and government clients as a more efficient way to pay and to be paid. We focus our attention within payables and receivables, specifically in process and payment, but we also offer optional opportunities for buyers and suppliers to finance. And because we transform documents into online and searchable electronic data, Syncada provides vast potential for analytics. Now we'll connect the dots a bit and review the Syncada AP automation solution from start to finish. In step 1, the customer sets up their suppliers as they always have, with the exception that they'll also be providing that setup information to Syncada so that we can get them ready and processing in the network. In step 2, once the setup is complete, the supplier sends invoices, electronic or paper, to Syncada. When electronic, the invoice is mapped into the Syncada user interface. For paper invoices, the Syncada mailroom scans and indexes and enters the invoice. Paper invoices are presented in the Syncada user interface within 1 to 3 days. So now those invoices are loaded into Syncada in a fully searchable format. Invoice records in Syncada include invoice header and all line item detail. In step 3, the buyer may also submit reference documents, such as orders, either through the user interface or by submitting an electronic file. Those reference documents are not required for invoice processing, but may be used for more sophisticated invoice auditing. Step 4 encompasses the invoice audits and account coding that occurs inside of Syncada. Steps often error-prone or even lacking in a manual or image-only processing environment. Syncada audits are based on our customers' own policies, or as we call them, business rules. The most common and important audits include duplicate checking, validating trading partners and valid obligations, and perhaps a document header level order-to-invoice match. Our more sophisticated customers also perform line item audits, either two-way audits, order-to-invoice, or three-way audits, order-invoice receipt. If an audit fails, the transaction is flagged as an audit exception for subsequent end-user review and resolution. Unless there's an audit exception, this step can occur almost immediately after the invoice is presented in Syncada. Using our customer's own chart of accounts, Syncada facilitates the automation and verification of accounting code allocations. Syncada is able to determine which account code to apply, either at the invoice or the line item level. Users may modify accounting in the UI even after the invoice is approved for payment. For instance, you can select one or more line items and split the accounting between two or more cost centers. Like with audits, allocation and coding occurs almost as soon as the invoice is presented in Syncada. And once the payment is authorized, no changes may be made to the invoice except modifications to accounting codes. Step 5 is routing and approval. Syncada may be configured to either route all invoices to a central or default queue for immediate processing or manual routing, or using the company's chart of authority, build a more sophisticated routing method. For instance, this invoice always starts in this specific queue, or this invoice starts in this queue and then moves to the next and the next queue. All invoice routing steps are recorded in a detailed audit trail history. Once the invoice is routed and approved, it's ready to be paid, and we move on to step 6, in which Syncada makes a call for funds to the buyer, which includes all approved invoices that are approaching payment terms. In step 7, the buyer answers the call for funds by making a single payment to Syncada across all suppliers. Syncada verifies receipt of the payment and moves to step 8, where we make a single payment to each supplier, even if multiple invoices are included. Syncada pays suppliers across currencies through a single electronic process. We can pay by check, electronic funds transfer such as ACH, wire, and purchasing card. Suppliers receive full remittance detail for each payment. Finally, in step 9, the buyer customer may want payment or accrual information to load into their financial system. There are simple or more sophisticated options. Files may be downloaded from the Syncada user interface in a CSV formatted spreadsheet, or you may receive an electronic file of header or line item detail information in multiple file formats. Step 10, analysis, is really not sequential, of course, but with all invoices and their detail captured electronically, AP or other stakeholder users can drill into a wealth of data to view or custom build reporting around general accounting, exception management, invoice aging, invoice lifecycle, and trading partner activity and performance. Syncada offers a suite of standard reports, or end users may build and save their own ad hoc reporting. Finally, a few words about financing. Syncada offers the ability to pay suppliers based on their trade terms, whether standard or extended. Our buyer customers can control their own float by initiating payment on only those invoices approaching term. Another option includes the ability for the buyer to allow suppliers to leverage buyer credit for early payment via counterparty financing. And of course, suppliers may also leverage buyer credit for early payment via purchasing card. So to review the value we offer our accounts payables customers, we can help reduce expenses by eliminating paper and check processing. We can improve invoice auditing and reducing invoices paid in error, offer financing opportunities, including managing payments to take full advantage of supplier trade terms, reducing or eliminating late fee penalties, consolidating AT payments into a single process, enhancing cash flow visibility and improving working capital management, improving financial controls and corporate policy enforcement, and providing the means for accessing a wealth of financial and procurement information upon which our customers can make informed decisions. So leveraging a couple of the customer values we've talked about in this previous slide, we can take a brief look at one case study of a large manufacturer of petrochemical products. As you can see, they have a large and diverse retail network that over time presented them some AP challenges, particularly along the lines of inefficiencies in their payment process, accuracy of information, and a corporate directive to reduce costs and generate AP and procurement reports. By implementing a Syncada solution, this buyer was able to turn invoices into electronic records and perform sophisticated audits to reduce billing and payment errors, all within the context of real-time invoice processing. In this case, the buyer was able to offer counterparty financing to their suppliers, which reduced supplier day sales outstanding, or DSO, to 2 days, while maintaining extended buyer repayment terms. Now, it's really important to note that it may not be reasonable to expect that all general payable suppliers will choose to participate in counterparty financing. However, the same impact can be achieved through an aggressive purchasing card initiative. At the least, buyers can manage the terms, capturing as much of their float as possible while making timely supplier payments. This company also considerably reduced administrative costs by removing manual paper and check handling and routing invoices for approval electronically. Added savings can be realized by encouraging suppliers to provide invoices electronically and to receive EFT payments. The key from our perspective, however, is that you don't have to start with an all-electronic invoicing solution to get there. And I would just reference that one poll result that 80% of you saw a barrier to supplier adoption. So let's start immediately by taking the paper out of your back office, by improving your processes, and then we can increment our way to electronic invoicing with a greater number of suppliers. This company was also interested in understanding their total landed costs for the product they distributed. By capturing all invoice and transportation-related data, they were able to determine current actual costs and model alternative scenarios in order to recommend implementation of other cost-saving measures in the enterprise. This is the conclusion of my presentation, and I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. Susie?
Thank you very much indeed, Kurt, and to Henry. Lots of questions coming through. Now is your opportunity in the last 10 minutes of this session to put your questions to Kurt and to Henry. So make sure that you pop them through. It would also be helpful if you state in your question who the question is directed to. So please do take up that invitation. Right, so questions that have come through already. A couple of viewers on the webinar have obviously been very interested in the solution that you've been walking through there, Kat. They want to know how you differ from your competitors.
Well, I think, first of all, although the market is seeing some consolidation around more or maybe more consensus that an end-to-end solution for this kind of processing is really desired, but it's still very, very fragmented. There are niche solutions all along the invoice lifecycle processing. You've got, imaging and routing solutions. Imaging seems to be a big, or OCR rather, seems to be a big player right now. Syncada would differ, I think, in that we take more of an end-to-end approach along the entire invoice lifecycle. So that's why we say that we have three primary focuses in processing invoices, in the payment of invoices. And then, of course, another differentiating factor from many competitors is that because we work through our partner banks, we can offer also some financing capabilities as well. Those are probably the primary differences.
Okay, good. Does this solution capture handwritten purchase order numbers?
Well, if the orders are entered through paper, we can accept that. We are not currently using an OCR technology for handwritten orders.
Okay, good. And how is VISO involved? What do they kind of bring to the table?
Well, of course, VISO is a brand that is very valuable to Syncada as we move along our journey. But they're obviously a part owner in the joint venture, and they have tremendous resources in the payment space. So from that perspective, I think the branding and the technology and all of the other intellectual capital that VISO brings to the table, as well as, and we can't underestimate this, VISO has been partnering with thousands and thousands of banks over the last decades, and we really feel that the banking industry really lends us a lot of credibility in this market space.
Okay, good. A question that I'd like to put to both of you. I'll start with you, Kurt, if I may, and then I'll move the same question on to Henry. As far as supplier adoption is concerned, in your opinion, how much do you think the financing aspect lends itself to a speedier adoption?
Well, the financing. Go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, anything that can help extend the value proposition for the supplier makes this more attractive. The base thing that many suppliers want, of course, is to understand when they will get paid and to get paid in an electronic format, so having certainty of the information. Another component of it is payment timing. So can I accelerate my payment? And I'll let Kurt take that piece.
Well, time is money. There's a value to getting your money earlier than it is to getting it later. Suppliers are continuously looking at their day sales outstanding, trying to understand how they can lower day sales outstanding. So if we have a financing arrangement where, for instance, in counterparty financing, where the buyer can extend their repayment terms, but the seller can get paid early, that's a huge plus.
Perfect. Thank you very much. From the time you receive a single payment to it being paid out, how long does that roughly take?
Well, it usually would take, it kind of depends on the precise setup, but usually if we're receiving an approved invoice, we're initiating payment the following day.
Okay, good. And could you just talk a little bit about the industries that are using Syncada? What kind of, are you across multiple industries? I've got a question here about kind of tech industries, retail industries. Are you pretty much cross-industry solution?
Well, yeah, we have a large government presence in Syncada. We have a large manufacturing presence in Syncada and retail presence in Syncada. I think for general payables, it's going to be in industries that are not diverse, well, geographically diverse, that have a lot of locations. There are oftentimes pain points with routing and approval of invoices when you're highly decentralized, visibility of the invoice when you're highly decentralized. So I think if you're looking at industries that are highly diverse geographically, that's probably a real sweet spot for us.
Okay, and in your opinion, Kurt, I take it that this is ERP agnostic. Do you see one ERP kind of clicking into this more elegantly than other ERPs, or are they all pretty much the same?
Well, I think ERPs are definitely moving into this space. I think we have obviously a head start on them in invoice processing, but the biggest I don't necessarily want to call it hurdle, because we integrate with any ERP. What's going to happen though is that with each implementation of Syncada, they have a unique or customized implementation of whatever ERP they've got, even if it's an SAP integration or an Oracle. They're going to have unique little bells and whistles on their ERP system that we're going to have to react to, and that's how we basically approach that.
Okay, but as far as your the connection is concerned, you find your clients have use of Oracle as well as SAP, and that you connect elegantly with any type of ERP or accounting system?
Oh, sure. We've connected with, I think, hundreds of them over the years. Sure. In many of our implementations.
Keep your questions coming, ladies and gentlemen. We only have a couple more moments. Question for Henry, please. As far as your study was concerned, Henry, and you've obviously got those, kind of 4 different steps, if you will, from the laggards to the early adopters. What would you say that the early adopters are doing to convince suppliers to participate in e-invoicing?
Well, firstly, they're letting their partner networks like Syncada by VISO manage that conversion for them. So it's not as much of a burden for the supplier, because the supplier may have already be in the network and already have trading partners in the network. So it may just be able to add another connection point for them. But the general enticement depends on the size of the supplier and the kind of relationship you have. Of course, suppliers, as Kurt pointed out, time is money. They want to get the information to you as fast as possible, and they want to know that that invoice is being processed. Today, in a paper world, we're emailing it around or sending it into the email. We don't know where it went. We don't know if it's approved. Through the network solutions, we now have ability to track some activity. The invoice set up to be paid. Is it going to be paid in 10 days? So it gives us more time to focus on the problem invoices if I'm a biller, and less time to focus on just chasing around, did you get the invoice and is it being processed? So we have some very important mechanisms that help the supplier in these networks learn more about and make it more context-rich for them.
Good. We have time only for 2 more questions, I'm afraid. So for Kurt, I have a question here. An organization is looking at e-invoicing technology, but has had kind of pushback resistance from IT, that they don't have the resources to support an implementation. Is this something that you come across often? What kind of resource is required, IT resource is required to get this off the ground?
Well, the good news, certainly, well, good news, if it is good news, is that you're not alone. If IT resources are a concern, we strongly recommend that you consider launching the program with a kind of low integration initial scope. As I indicated, you can still realize much of the benefit of electronic invoicing by redirecting your paper invoice to a service such as ours, converting that paper into searchable electronic records. You will have eliminated the paper, and also streamlined auditing, coding, and approval routing. Integrating GL information can be as simple as downloading from Syncada in a CSV format and, like creating a simple spreadsheet upload map to your GL. If that's not possible, you could receive a formatted flat file, for instance, from us that is easier than more sophisticated options such as EDI. But if all is said and done and more advanced integration is an absolute requirement, you probably should work with your vendor to get them to help you build a business case to demonstrate a return on the investment, or maybe even solicit third-party help either from the vendor directly or through another integration partner. Lastly, I really would never underestimate, if you want to get going on this road, don't ever underestimate that the knowledge and experience of your professional colleagues out there. Attend local seminars and trade shows, get on and participate in professional association blogs, because other people have started on this journey, and they may have good information for how you can get past some of these obstacles.
Perfect. Okay, good. And just briefly, if you wouldn't mind, Kurt, could you just say a few words more about the online visibility and how that can actually help reduce errors, save money? Just a few words on that.
Yeah.
Challenge,
well,
I know, sorry.
Yeah. Well, and I don't mean to presume the context of the question from the listener, but over time I've actually come to view the term online visibility as kind of feel-good sales speak that maybe has little substance. The fact is you can have online visibility and still not maybe get all the value out of it that you want. For instance, if an invoice picture image is visible online, or if you get an email of an invoice, what can be done with it other than perhaps routing it? You're still viewing an object just like you would a paper document. It's like Henry said in his presentation, it's the data on the image, or it's the data on the invoice that's the key. With the data, you can apply all those business rules and corporate policies that audit and every invoice, streamline the handling, automate the back office chores such as account coding, and then retain an extremely deep analytical source. Electronic invoicing gets you the data, and data leads to information. Information leads to knowledgeable decisions for the user and the enterprise.
Perfect. Kurt Dahl and Henry Ijams, thank you very much indeed. And just some closing notes for the viewer. We have a number of webinars coming up that may very well be of interest to you. And also we have our Chicago Purchase to Pay, Procure to Pay Leaders Summit taking place in May, which you're very much invited to. I'd also just like to add that the report that was being referred to by Henry during his piece will be emailed out to all of you following on from this webinar. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and attention. Thank you to Henry and to Kurt, and we look forward to welcoming you next time. Goodbye.